The courtroom was filled with a tense silence broken only by the soft shuffle of papers and the creak of benches as people settled in. Onlookers whispered among themselves, their eyes flickering toward the man sitting at the defendant's table. His name was Jack Morgan, a former decorated Army sergeant turned civilian. Once praised for his service overseas, Jack now found himself at the center of a high-profile criminal trial. He sat still, his face calm, but his eyes distant. War had changed him, and so had life after it. The charges against him were serious: assault, resisting arrest, and unlawful possession of a firearm. The prosecution claimed he had violently attacked a local man during a bar altercation, but Jack maintained it was self-defense. He hadn't gone looking for trouble. It had found him. At the front of the courtroom, Judge Elaine Parker entered with her usual composure. Known for being tough but fair, she looked over the case files with a practiced eye. As she glanced up at the defendant, something about Jack made her pause. There was a flicker of recognition, subtle but unmistakable. She composed herself and proceeded with the formalities, hiding any sign that she might know the man before her. "Mr. Morgan," she said clearly, "you stand accused of several serious charges. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," Jack replied, his voice even. The trial had officially begun. The air seemed thicker now, charged with unspoken tension. What no one knew, not the jury, not the press, not even Jack himself, was that Judge Parker was about to uncover a truth that would turn this entire case on its head. As the prosecution began laying out their version of the events, Judge Parker found her mind drifting. Something that rarely happened. She kept stealing glances at Jack Morgan. The name, the face, even the posture. It tugged at something buried deep in her memory. Meanwhile, the prosecutor painted a damning picture. The defendant, clearly intoxicated, lashed out without provocation, he said, pointing to images of the victim's injuries. "He is not above the law just because he once wore a uniform." Jack sat motionless, his jaw tight. He had heard words like these before. Since returning home, his status as a veteran seemed to mean little in a world that had moved on. He was no hero here, just another man accused. His attorney, a young public defender named Rachel Kim, stood to counter. "Mr. Morgan acted in self-defense. Witnesses admit the alleged victim initiated the confrontation. Mr. Morgan tried to de-escalate, but was left with no choice." She turned toward the jury. His military service doesn't exempt him from the law, but neither should it be ignored when considering his character. Judge Parker's gavel struck to signal a short recess. As she retreated to her chambers, her hand trembled slightly. She opened an old drawer, digging through decades of memories, until she found it. A photograph from a war zone, a dusty road, a field hospital, and among the faces, a young man with weary eyes, Jack Morgan. He had saved her life 18 years ago. She had been a young Army medic, wounded during an ambush. Jack, then a sergeant, had carried her out under fire. She owed him everything, and now he didn't even recognize her. She closed the drawer and took a deep breath. The trial wasn't just about justice anymore. It was personal. Back in the courtroom, the atmosphere had grown heavier. The jury returned to their seats, and witnesses began to testify. The first was the bartender from the night of the altercation. "He wasn't looking for a fight," she said, nodding toward Jack. "The other guy kept pushing him, calling him names, baby killer, and worse. Jack just tried to leave." Judge Parker listened carefully, though her thoughts kept drifting back to that war-torn field. She remembered the blood, the chaos, and the searing pain in her leg. Jack's voice had been the only steady thing amid the screaming. "You're gonna make it, Doc. I've got you." She had blacked out before they reached safety, but she'd never forgotten those words. In the courtroom, Jack's lawyer called a surprise witness, Jack's former commanding officer, Colonel Daniel Briggs, now retired. "Jack Morgan was one of the finest soldiers I ever served with," he said firmly. "He earned the Bronze Star for his actions during Operation Thunder Ridge. He saved more lives than I can count." The prosecutor objected. "Your Honor, his military record isn't relevant to the charges at hand." Judge Parker paused. "Overruled. I'll allow it, for now." Colonel Briggs continued. "The man you're trying today was trained to protect and serve. He saw things over there that would break most people. He didn't come back the same, but he never lost his sense of duty. Jack finally looked up, eyes misty. It was the first sign of emotion he'd shown since the trial began. Judge Parker clenched her jaw, torn between her role and her memories. The lines between justice and loyalty were beginning to blur. She needed to stay impartial, but how could she, knowing what she knew? The courtroom fell quiet again as Jack took the stand in his own defense. His lawyer guided him gently through the questions, knowing full well that Jack wasn't comfortable speaking about his past, especially not in public. "Mr. Morgan," she asked, "can you tell the court what happened that night?" Jack sighed, eyes fixed on a distant spot only he could see. "I went to the bar because I couldn't sleep. Happens a lot. Nightmares, you know?" His voice was steady but carried a weight that made even the jury lean in closer. "I was sitting alone. Then this guy started talking trash. Called me a murderer. Said I probably killed kids overseas. I tried to ignore him, but he followed me out into the parking lot." He paused. "He swung at me first. I blocked it, pushed him back. He came at me again. That's when I defended myself. I didn't want trouble." His lawyer nodded and added, "And the weapon they found on you?" Jack nodded grimly. "It wasn't mine. I disarmed him. I took it so he wouldn't use it on me. That's when the cops showed up." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Parker leaned forward, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. Every word Jack said was like a ghost from her own past. She could almost hear gunfire in the distance. The prosecutor tried to break him during cross-examination. "So you expect us to believe you're the victim?" Jack didn't flinch. "I'm not asking you to believe anything. I'm just telling the truth." Judge Parker stared at him long and hard. The same courage that saved her life years ago was now laid bare in this courtroom, and it was that same courage that might save him again. As the court recessed for lunch, Judge Parker remained in her chambers, staring at the old photograph once more. The faces in it were younger, untouched by the burden of years. Jack Morgan had saved her when he didn't have to. Now, here he was, broken, misunderstood, and fighting for his freedom. She thought back to that day. The medevac chopper had barely arrived in time. Jack had refused to leave her side until she was safely loaded in. It was only later, during recovery, that she learned his entire unit had been ambushed, and he had returned to the line just hours after delivering her to safety. Outside the courtroom, Jack sat silently in a waiting room with Rachel, his lawyer. "You're doing good," she said softly. "The jury's listening. They saw something today, something human." Jack gave a short nod, but he didn't seem convinced. "Doesn't matter. To them, I'm just a story they heard on the news. Angry vet goes off the rails. That's how it always is." Rachel hesitated. "Not to everyone." Back inside, Judge Parker made a decision. She called for court to resume and address both attorneys. "Before we move further, I'd like to request a sealed sidebar. There is something I need to disclose." The attorneys approached, confused. Once the microphones were muted and the jury dismissed briefly, she spoke. "I know the defendant. I didn't remember him at first, but now I do. 18 years ago, in Afghanistan, Jack Morgan saved my life during an enemy assault." Both lawyers were stunned. Rachel looked at Jack, his face frozen in disbelief. "I wanted to make this known before we proceed," Parker continued. "I will recuse myself if either side believes I cannot remain impartial." The courtroom braced itself. The truth was now in the open, and everything had changed. The courtroom buzzed with tension as word of the judge's revelation spread. Though the sidebar had been sealed, the court clerk's expression and the lawyer's body language suggested something significant had shifted. Jack sat motionless, stunned by what he had heard behind closed doors. Judge Parker, the woman presiding over his fate, was someone from a past he barely allowed himself to think about. He remembered her now, just faintly. The medic he'd carried, the one who kept whispering, "Don't leave me," as bullets flew overhead. Back in the courtroom, Judge Parker addressed the court again, now with remarkable calm. "For the record," she said, "I disclosed a personal connection to the defendant from nearly 2 decades ago. I offered both legal teams the option to request my recusal." The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. "We see no evidence of bias yet, Your Honor. The state is prepared to proceed." Rachel stood slowly. The defense has no objection. Jack glanced at her, surprised. She gave him a reassuring look. Part strategy, part trust. Judge Parker nodded. Very well. Let's continue. As the trial resumed, the atmosphere had clearly changed. The jury had seen Jack in a new light. Not just a man on trial, but a soldier who had lived through hell and still stood with quiet dignity. Rachel brought forward Jack's medical records, proof of his PTSD, anxiety, and the sleepless nights. An expert testified on the psychological weight veterans often carry, especially when reintegrating into civilian life without proper support. By now, even the prosecutor seemed more measured, his arguments less forceful, more cautious. The jury listened, visibly conflicted. Behind her bench, Judge Parker kept her expression neutral. But deep down, she knew this trial was no longer about guilt alone. It was about understanding. Rachel stood before the jury, holding a small, weathered notebook. This belonged to Jack Morgan during his last deployment, she said gently. He never showed it to anyone, until now. She opened it to reveal pages filled with raw, handwritten entries. Some described enemy ambushes, others the names of fallen comrades. But one passage stood out. Rachel read aloud. They say war ends when you come home. But for me, it plays on loop. Every scream, every shot, every life I couldn't save. I try to be normal, but I don't know what that is anymore. I just want peace. The courtroom was silent. Even the prosecutor lowered his eyes. Jack sat with his hands folded, staring ahead. It wasn't pity he wanted. It was understanding. He had lived a life of service, only to come back to a country where many saw him as damaged, dangerous, or disposable. The final witness was a young woman named Grace Delaney. Jack saved my brother, she said. He pulled him out of a burning Humvee during a mortar attack. We wrote him letters for years, but he never answered. I think he just didn't know how to stay connected. Rachel gave her a small nod. Thank you, Grace. When the defense rested, the jury was given their instructions. The closing arguments were brief. The prosecution maintained Jack had broken the law. Rachel, however, ended with quiet conviction. We ask our soldiers to do the unthinkable, and when they come home broken, we treat them like criminals. Jack Morgan didn't fail society. Society failed him. But you don't have to. You can choose to see the man behind the uniform. The jury left to deliberate. Every tick of the clock now felt like a drumbeat to destiny. Hours passed. The jury was still out. Jack remained quiet, barely moving. The courtroom had emptied out except for a few reporters, Rachel and Judge Parker, who lingered behind her bench, thumbing through the court files. But her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't help but reflect on the cruel irony. The system she had sworn to uphold had become the very thing Jack now stood against. A man who had risked everything to protect others was now being judged by people who had never walked a day in his boots. Rachel broke the silence beside him. Whatever happens, you showed them who you are. That matters. Jack gave a faint nod. I'm just tired, Rachel. Tired of fighting battles I didn't ask for. Just then, the jury filed back into the room. Everyone straightened. The foreman stood, holding a folded slip of paper, so small, yet it carried the weight of Jack's future. Judge Parker read the verdict silently before passing it to the court clerk. In the matter of the state versus Jack Morgan, the clerk began, on the charge of unlawful possession of a firearm, not guilty. A hushed breath swept through the room. On the charge of assault, not guilty. Jack's jaw clenched. His hands trembled, though his face showed no emotion. On the charge of resisting arrest, guilty with recommendation for probation due to mitigating circumstances. Rachel sighed in relief. Jack wouldn't walk free today, but he wouldn't be behind bars either. It was more than they had dared hope for. Judge Parker looked directly at Jack. You are hereby sentenced to 12 months probation, including counseling and community service. This court recognizes your service and the complexities of your return. You deserve more than punishment. You deserve healing. Jack finally looked up, eyes locked with hers. Eyes. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Jack remained seated. People passed by offering polite nods. Reporters whispered into their recorders, but Jack didn't react. He wasn't used to attention, especially not the kind that came with courtroom drama. Rachel touched his shoulder gently. You did it, Jack. You're going home. He nodded, slowly rising. Not sure what that means anymore, but thank you for fighting for me. Rachel smiled. You're not just a client. You're a person worth fighting for. Don't forget that. Before leaving, Judge Parker motioned for Jack to approach the bench. The bailiff hesitated, then stepped aside. Jack walked forward, uncertain. She leaned forward, lowering her voice so only he could hear. You don't remember me, do you? Jack looked at her more closely now. There was something in her eyes, something familiar. Then it hit him. You're Doc from Bagram. His voice caught in his throat. Judge Parker nodded. You saved my life, Jack. I've never forgotten. I meant what I said. You deserve healing. Let this be your second chance. He stood there stunned. I didn't think anyone even remembered that day. I do, she said softly, and I always will. They held each other's gaze for a long moment. No medals, no applause, just mutual recognition. Two soldiers, scarred by war and time, who had once crossed paths in a moment of life and death. Jack gave her a slow, solemn nod. Thank you, ma'am. She smiled faintly. Take care of yourself, Sergeant. As he turned to leave, the courtroom felt different, lighter somehow. The trial was over, but something deeper had begun. Redemption. Jack Morgan hadn't just survived the war. Today, he'd survived something even harder. Coming home. The sun was low in the sky as Jack stepped outside the courthouse. For the first time in years, the world felt still. No sirens, no shouting, just the soft hum of cars and the breeze rustling through trees. Rachel walked beside him, her briefcase in one hand. You've got a second shot, Jack. Don't waste it. I won't, he said quietly, watching as people passed by without giving him a second glance. For once, he didn't mind the anonymity. He didn't need recognition. Just a fresh start. A few reporters approached with cameras, but Rachel waved them off. No comments, she said firmly. Jack gave a small smile of gratitude. He'd had enough of being a headline. Later that week, Jack sat in a modest office with a therapist appointed by the court. He was hesitant at first, unsure what to say, but slowly he began to open up about the war, about the guilt, about how hard it was to sleep without reliving the screams. You're not alone, the therapist told him. You never were. Jack started volunteering at a local veterans center. He met other men and women like him, people who had worn the uniform, come home changed, and struggled to fit into a world that no longer made sense. For the first time in a long time, Jack didn't feel like a ghost. One afternoon, he received a letter, handwritten. The envelope was crisp and official. Dear Sergeant Morgan, your service saved my life, and your courage in that courtroom changed it again. I hope this country finds a way to honor all its soldiers like you. Until then, know that you are seen. Elaine Parker, U.S. District Judge. Jack folded the letter gently, placed it in the notebook he now carried again, and walked outside. The war might never leave him completely, but for the first time, he was walking towards something, not away.